Good evening, everyone. Uh, Welcome to our January webinar. The topic that we will be talking about this evening is perfectionism and how it relates to hair pulling. Before we start with the webinar, I would like to ask you to take a look at the poll that I've activated for next month. When I'm done with the main part of the webinar, I will stop the poll and then we will see what topic won, and that's what the subject will be next month. If you have a proposal for a topic, please use the Q&A part, the same place where you ask questions, and just type something like topic proposal and then type what is it that you would like to hear about, in case nothing that's suggested here is interesting to you, or you feel like there's another topic that might be important. I have my notepad here and I will write everything down and then I will put that in the poll for next month. So without further ado, let's go. This is our content for today. So as always, we will first define what is it that we're talking about, which is perfectionism. We'll talk a little bit about the psychology of perfectionism. I will present several different perspectives, and then you can choose and see what resonates with you and what makes sense to you. We will talk about how we get from perfectionism to hair pulling. And then I will introduce several techniques that might help you handle and cope with perfectionism. After that, as always, we will go to the Q&A part, and then you can ask anything that you're curious about. I welcome questions even when I'm talking. So if there's something that I say that it's not clear to you, or you want me to go in, give you additional details on something, write it in the Q&A and I will get to it after the webinar. So this webinar I was really excited about the topic because I think it's very relevant practically for a lot of people who struggle with hair pulling. But then when I started researching and assembling the PowerPoint, I wanted to start with some kind of solid and good definition. And everything that I managed to find was so technical that it really put me off. And I cannot imagine what it would be like for people who are not psychotherapists or psychologists. So this is an example of a definition that I found. So enjoy. The overdependence of self-evaluation on the determined pursuit and achievement of self-imposed personally demanding standards of performance in at least one salient domain, despite the occurrence of adverse consequences. I mean, I guess we can say one thing. Everything fit into this one sentence, and it was obviously written by a perfectionist, but I don't think it's easily digestible and certainly not practical. So, sorry. So when I found several definitions like this, I decided to kind of split my search in two distinctly different directions. One was something slightly more academic, yet psychologically relevant. So I decided to present a psychoanalytic view of perfectionism, and then something that would fall more into the domain of, let's say, pop psychology, meaning something that would be very easy to understand and very relatable, so that I can give you two different perspectives, and then you can see what works for you. And then, of course, I wouldn't be me if I didn't present a constructivist perspective on perfectionism. And if this is not your first webinar, then I'm sure you're not at all surprised. So let's start with the psychoanalytic perspective. This is Karen Horney. She's one of the more famous early psychoanalysts. And she's also a Cocker Spaniel. Well, she was also a Cocker Spaniel breeder, which kind of makes her one of my favorite psychoanalysts. She has an essay that I highly recommend that you read. I will give you several quotes from the essay here, but if you like psychoanalytic language and if this way of thinking is something that appeals to you, this essay is absolutely recommended. It's called The Tyranny of the Should, and you can find it, I think, for free online. Well, someone uploaded it in PDF anyway. So here is how she starts thinking about perfectionism. We have discussed so far, she says, about something previously written, chiefly how the neurotic tries to actualize his idealized self with regard to the outside world, in achievements, in the glory of success or power or triumph. Just one brief thing, since this is a very old essay, so it's almost a century old. She talks about him, which is this kind of generic hypothetical person. So it doesn't. I didn't want to change it to person or anything like this because it is a quote. So just put it in context. It doesn't necessarily refer to males. So neurotic claims too are concerned with the world outside himself. He tries to assert the exceptional rights to which his uniqueness entitles him whenever and in whatever ways he can. So here she says essentially that a perfectionist somewhere deep inside has a sense of entitlement to be exceptional in some way. So this is something that I will come back to later on, so just kind of put a pin here. His feeling entitled to be above necessities and laws allows him to live in a world of fiction as if he were indeed above them. So because the perfectionist feels entitled to something, even when that something is not realistic, so what she says, above necessities and laws, he kind of creates this imaginary world, a fantasy, where he creates this vision of what perfect is and what he is, so what he's entitled to. Like when you can't achieve it in actual reality, you then go to the fantasy world. And whenever he falls palpably short of being his idealized self, his claims enable him to make factors outside himself responsible for such failures. These would be people who imagine something highly unrealistic, and then when that doesn't happen because it's, well, unrealistic, they resort to blaming other people so that they don't take responsibility for their own unrealistic vision. Let's see what else she has to say. The neurotic sets to work to mold himself into a supreme being of his own making. So this has to do with that kind of sense of entitlement and striving for perfection. So it's not satisfactory to be very good at something. You need to be a supreme being. This, I guess, in a practical sense, refers to the standards that perfectionists tend to set for themselves. He, the perfectionist, neurotic, holds before his soul his image of perfection and unconsciously tells himself, and this is a very good quote, so pay attention. Forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are. This is how you should be. And to be this idealized self is all that matters. You should be able to endure everything, to understand everything, to like everybody, to be always productive. If this sounds familiar, you just might be a perfectionist. This is a very important point here. So previously she said that the perfectionist kind of has this sense of entitlement to be this supreme being, and that the perfectionist sets himself on the course to become that supreme being. But there's this little voice that says, yeah, but you're really not that. You're this kind of very disgraceful creature. So a perfectionist kind of always feels like a fraud because deep down, even when it's not conscious, there's always this kind of nagging information that you are not that and you cannot be that. But nonetheless, you must strive. So failure is already embedded in perfectionism. Like I can strive to fly, but I will just never develop wings, right? Now let's move on a little bit to something more contemporary. I really like this essay and I will come back to it once or twice more, but I don't want to bore you with psychoanalytic theory if that's not your cup of tea. This is Brené Brown, and she's quite well known, and she's an excellent speaker and a very good writer. I don't think her ideas are particularly original, so everything she has to say has already been said 150,000 times in the past, primarily by certain psychoanalysts, but she has this really good way, a very relatable way of delivering these ideas. So what does she say about perfectionism? She says the following: perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to do your best. Perfectionism is not about healthy achievement and growth. Perfectionism is not self-improvement or striving for excellence. So when you say, I just want to, do the best I can, that's not perfectionism. Let's see what she says perfectionism is. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, look perfect, act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's preventing us from taking flight. So it's a shield that kind of poses a burden more than it actually protects. And there's another point here that I feel the need to emphasize, which is here where she says, live perfect, look perfect, act perfect. So act perfect would be my word to emphasize. And also this thing about avoiding blame, judgment, and shame. So perfectionism is not about looking perfect because perfection is something that you actually need. It's about looking perfect so that you wouldn't be judged or that you wouldn't feel shame. But it's simply, it's a way to avoid facing something. This is why she says it's a shield. It's a shield against other people, but it's also a shield against us seeing ourselves for what we really are. Perfectionism is not self-improvement. Perfectionism is, at its core, about trying to earn approval and acceptance. Most perfectionists were raised being praised for achievement and performance. So grades, manners, rule following, people pleasing, appearance, sports. Somewhere along the way, we adopted this dangerous and debilitating belief system. I am what I accomplish and how well I accomplish it. And then this is the central thing for me. Please perform perfect. Healthy striving is self-focused. Perfectionism is other-focused. So self-focused would be, I really want to, I don't know, learn a new language because I like languages. Other-focused is, I have to learn a new language because people will think I'm smart. And this is a fundamental difference between wanting to do your best and wanting to improve and being a perfectionist. One is about what fulfills me, and the other is about what will other people perceive as me being fulfilled, or what is it that other people think I should be. So this quote is, both quotes are from her book called The Gifts of Imperfection, and it's a very light reading and I really recommend it. I think you might find it informative. So the key thing, she also gives here in this quote, she gives a bit of a hint about how we become perfectionists and why perfectionism is not something that you can deal with very quickly. So there are no shortcuts and there are no life hacks and there are no mantras to repeat to stop being a perfectionist. The reason why, because it's essentially a developmental thing. So it's about how you were raised. It's about the rules that you interiorized and that you adopted. So everything from your environment, all the feedbacks you were getting from your parents, teachers, important people in your life, you kind of built that in. So in a sense, it's a core of who you are. Not the only thing, but one of the core things. And so the key word to take away from this is perform. In this part where she says, please perform perfect. So it's not about being perfect, it's about seeming perfect. So perfectionism in that sense is profoundly inauthentic. So sometimes people don't really say they're perfectionists, but we can map out a lot of behaviors that are, let's say, perfectionism adjacent. So procrastination is often a sign of perfectionism. The reason why is that a perfectionist will postpone testing his perfection. So if you anticipate that you will fail at something, or you're terrified that you will fail, you will put it off. So if you have to study, for example, and you have to learn something that's very difficult, and you're kind of not really sure or convinced that you're smart enough, you're going to read another book or watch something on Netflix or take a walk or call your friend or check social networks. You'll do anything but not study. So procrastination in this specific example would be a way to postpone failing at studying. So it would be a way for you not to face your fears of not being smart enough, for example. Perfectionists are more likely to compare themselves to other people. So this is something that I see very often. That, people will say things like, well, this person does it, why can't I? Or look, this person does these 20 things and they seem happy and relaxed. Why am I not relaxed? Or why am I not happy? Or why can't I do all these 20 things? Perfectionists also very frequently seek reassurance, because perfectionism is, as Brené Brown said, other focused. Then the only way that you know that you're doing well is if someone validates you, because you don't have clear criteria and you don't have achievable, realistic criteria. Then your self-image depends on validation and invalidation from other people. Expecting validation kind of adds to this. Overachieving is obviously something that perfectionists would be guilty of. And then avoiding performance tests or assessments. I cannot tell you how many clients I've had over the years who are 20-something, but they just cannot seem to finish college. They just cannot pass those last tests because they can't focus on studying, or they have panic attacks when they think about tests, or they just kind of sleep in and just never get around to doing the tests. Perfectionists in general absolutely hate being assessed in any way, because where you have assessment, you have possibility of failure. Where you have assessment, you have judgments. So this is not something that perfectionists will like to do. And then because they overachieve and because they have these impossibly high standards, excessive organizing and list making is something that logically follows as being present when you have perfectionism. So I hope you're following me until now. So how do we get from all this, from the way that we defined in these features that we kind of isolated, so from perfectionism to hair pulling? So what's the road? If you've been to my previous webinar, the one about avoidance, then you might already have an idea. So I'm going to go back to Karen Horney, the psychoanalyst, and her essay, The Tyranny of Should. So according to her, these shoulds that we have a kind of coercive power. We fear our shoulds the way dictators are feared. In fact, the essay is called The Tyranny of Shoulds after all. So according to her, when you have these dictatorial, tyrannical shoulds in your head, always telling you what you should be doing or what you should be achieving, or should whatever, there's always anxiety, there's always threat, and then there's always guilt. So just even if you don't fail at anything, just living with those shoulds in your mind is already anxiety inducing, because whatever you do, rest assured that there's a should around the corner. And that should will be very strict, very punishing, and you will have to do what it says, and you're still very likely to fail. So if you're not obedient enough or cooperative enough with your shoulds, there's always anxiety there. When we have intense anxiety, when we have a lot of guilt, or when we have threat or panic because we might fail, if we don't know how to cope with our emotions, we're very, very likely to employ some sort of defense mechanism or avoidance mechanism to attenuate or avoid the anxiety. And so here's what Karen Horney says. She gives several examples here, and then let's take a look at them. So she says, reactions of anxiety often escape attention because the customary defenses against anxiety are set going instantaneously. So this means that sometimes you might even know that you're anxious because the mechanism to avoid anxiety is so fast, especially when you've been pulling for a very long time and when you've been living with perfectionism for a very long time, that this switch is so fast that there's almost no conscious awareness of it. So it just happens like this. So she says, thus a man who felt he should be a saint-like friend realized that he had been harsh towards a friend when he might have been helpful and went on a heavy drinking spree. So you realize that you failed your friend or you're treated them unfairly. You go on a drinking spree to avoid feeling guilt or anxiety. Again, a woman who felt that she should always be pleasant and likable was mildly criticized by a friend for not having invited another friend to a party. She felt a fleeting anxiety, was for a moment physically close to fainting, and reacted to that with an increased need for affection, which was her way of checking anxiety. So she feels intense anxiety, and then immediately she turns for affection because affection is reassurance and validation, and that calms her down and then alleviates anxiety. A man under duress of unfulfilled shoots evolved an acute urge to sleep with some woman. Sexuality for him was a means to feel wanted and to reestablish his sunken self-respect. This is also a very common mechanism. So the same thing applies to pulling. Once you anticipate, consciously or not, that anxiety or some other intense emotion might feel, pulling, especially automatic, this goes for automatic pulling especially, you immediately switch to that so that you don't even feel anxiety. And this is very often why when I start working with clients in TrichStop, and when we talk about emotions and thoughts that precede pulling, they sometimes say, I don't have any thoughts, which of course is impossible since they're alive, they have some thoughts. Or they will say, well, I don't feel anything, which again is not possible. You may not feel a clearly defined emotion, but if you just pay attention to your body right now, there's no way that you don't feel anything. Like if you're sitting on a chair, you feel, where you're pressing against the chair you're sitting on. So you have to feel something. But because you go from potential anxiety to pulling, sometimes you don't even consciously develop the emotion because the mechanism is so fast. So that means that the first task for such a person would be to develop awareness. And this is where I usually emphasize body awareness because this is where we're most likely to notice emotions. So I hope this connection between perfectionism and hair pulling is clear from this example. So now I'm going to give you a constructivist perspective on perfectionism for one reason only. Well, two reasons. One reason is because I really like Kelly and his constructivist psychology. And then the second reason is because constructivism will give you specifically here a way to very practically observe perfectionism in the way that you talk, in the way that you do things, and in the way that you feel. And then we will use these ideas to kind of devise a way for coping with anxiety. So it has a very practical nature, constructivism. So before we go to discuss how constructivists see perfectionism, I will give you some points that you need to know so that you can follow me and understand what I'm talking about. So constructivism is called constructivism because Kelly thought that we have these structures that he called constructs that we use to explain the world. So constructs arise from our experience and they help us explain the world, so to give it meaning, and then give us direction to act so that we can, find our way around the world. Not all constructs are the same. There's always a hierarchy of constructs. Those on the very top make up your identity. Those on the bottom of the hierarchy are tools in which you cultivate or achieve your values in one way or another. So every construct has two sides. I gave you a few examples here of very generic constructs that might not really be psychologically meaningful for you. So there's good versus bad. That's something that everyone knows of, right? So there's happy, sad, black, white, whatever. You can, the constructs that guide our world are not necessarily these kind of very generic labels. Those are kind of distinctions that that are really meaningful for us. So don't cling to these labels. I just gave a few examples. When you're trying to figure out what your constructs are, go inward. I was giving recently another lecture on perfectionism, and someone made a remark and said, well, I can't give up my perfectionism because otherwise I would just be lazy and mediocre. And this is also a construct for that person. Either you're a perfectionist or you're lazy and mediocre. So that's a construct. That's not everyone's construct, but for that person, it was a relevant one. Because a construct tells us if we're not a good person, then we're a bad person, right? So it gives us a choice, and each choice carries certain actions with it. So the trouble with perfectionism is not so much in the content of our constructs. The content can also be a problem, but most often it's not what we want, but how we go about doing it. So it's the way that we apply or use our constructs that's the problem. And this is what Kelly was concerned with. In his theory, he developed quite a number of things that he called diagnostic constructs, three of which we will use today. These diagnostic constructs tell us how we apply certain constructs, so how we use them. There are three that are important. One is impermeability, the second is preemptive constraint, and then the third one is hostility. Hostility for Kelly is something entirely different from what we normally think of as hostility, and it's probably my favorite thing that Kelly ever wrote about because it is just brilliant. So I will explain these three terms briefly and then give you examples from my clients, and so you can see how they actually operate in everyday life. So let's see what impermeability is. Here's an example here. It really bothers me that when I go through my hair, I feel some that are thicker and that stand out in terms of how they feel. I pull those. The only way to stop is for all my hair to be uniform. This is one example. I will tell you later on what's impermeable here. I know, I get it. Too much on my plate. But I can't let my husband do anything because he does it wrong. I have too much on my plate because he doesn't know where the plates go when he washes them. There's really only one place to put them. How hard is it? So to answer your question, yes, only I can do these things. Let's see another example. What makes me a bad mother? Well, I don't spend enough time with my kids. We often eat fast food because I'm too tired to cook. I work too much, but I have to work too much because I also have a career. We don't have enough fun time together. I can't tutor them as often. My mother did all that for me. The only way to be a good mother is to do everything that a good mother is supposed to do. So speaking of unrealistic criteria and unrealistic expectations, this client, when I encouraged her to talk about her mother a little bit, because, you know, if her mother was the superwoman, it was really she was worth, learning about. Turns out her mother was a stay-at-home mom. So when you don't work 10 hours a day, then apparently you have time to do other things. But in my client's perfectionistic mind, that was completely irrelevant. So what are we talking about when we talk about impermeability? Remember, we said that every construct has two sides, so two poles. You have one pole of the construct, and that pole accepts only one element. Whereas every other element that we apply this construct to is on the other side. So if you have your desirable side of the construct that has a lot of criteria that have to be met for something to be seen as that. So if you want to be a good mother, there's this long list of things that you have to do to be a good mother. Unless you meet all the criteria on that list, you're a bad mother. So if there are 10 things you have to do and you do 9 out of 10, bad mother. Only 10 out of 10 is a good mother. So this is the impermeable constraint, when there's really only one way to do something. Impermeable constraint is really a nuisance because it generates negative self-image within a millisecond. Sometimes when this is applied in everyday life, it's almost like it's a filter for the negative. It's almost like you don't even look at the list to see what is it that you actually do well. You immediately go towards what you don't do well. So impermeable constraint tends to kind of neglect what's good and just puts the negative in the forefront. A pop culture example of impermeable constraint would be, well, I forgot her name, but Meryl Streep's character in Devil Wears Prada. You know, like when someone comes in, she looks at them and she says, those shoes, no. So everything else that you're wearing is irrelevant because you're wearing those shoes. That would be an example of impermeability. So let's see what preemptive constraint is. Like I said, this is called a diagnostic construct because it's a construct, it has two sides, right? The opposite of preemptive is propositional. So this is the dimension that I will be briefly talking about. Let's start again with a practical example. So the man on the picture here is Dostoevsky. But who is Dostoevsky? So many people would say, most people would say that he was one of the greatest, if not the greatest novelist of all times. But then, not everyone really quite agrees with that. There are people, some of whom I deeply respect, who say that he was a sloppy, even mediocre writer. So who are these people, you may wonder? Well, Tolstoy was one of them. Tolstoy, there are several places where Tolstoy wrote about Dostoevsky, and he emphasized that technically he was a bad writer. So he may have been the greatest novelist, but he was also a bad writer. And one of the examples that I remember that Tolstoy gave, because when I read that, I thought, oh, yes, that's true, I remember this, is that somewhere in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky described a table and said it was an oval round-shaped table. Because, you know, ovals tend to be triangular. He has a lot of these things. So he's also a sloppy writer. But then he's also a great psychologist. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche once said that the only psychologist who ever had anything to teach him was Dostoevsky. So for Nietzsche, he was a psychologist, not a writer. I know some people, including one of my good friends, who says that Dostoevsky is really just a glorified crime writer because of Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov. There are some people who consider him to be complete pretentious trash. One of these people was Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian-American writer, and one of my favorite writers, who said that Nabokov was a bad writer who was only able to write about, and I quote, crazy people and neurotics. For many, like Camus and Sartre, he was the first existentialist, so he was also a philosopher. And then for many people, he was an ideologue as well. Maxim Gorky, another Russian writer, said kind of talked about Dostoevsky being very political because of the way that he would portray lower classes and the proletariat, not in flattering terms. Nabokov, who was politically as far away from Gorky as anyone can possibly be, also said the same thing. And he said that Dostoevsky's emphasis and his idealistic view of Russian Orthodox Christianity was not because he believed in it, but was really because by emphasizing this kind of mystical form of Christianity, Dostoevsky was actually separating Russia from Western rationality. And for Nabokov, that was a profoundly political act and a damaging one at that, because for Nabokov and for, I guess, everyone in the West, Dostoevsky and Russian culture is about as European as you can get. You know, find me a composer who's more European than Tchaikovsky. So for Nabokov, that was also political. So he was also a politician. So I ask you, who is Dostoevsky? If we look at Dostoevsky in a propositional way, so if we construe Dostoevsky propositionally, he's all of these things at the same time. So that's propositional, meaning that preemptive would be the opposite, saying that he's trash and nothing else, or the greatest novelist of all times and nothing else. Here are some examples of how preemptive constraint looks like. So this is Truman Capote on the picture, and these are two of his quotes. One of them is, all literature is gossip. So this is preemptive, because essentially what he says is all books that were ever written were gossip and nothing else. So you reduce everything that was ever written to just one thing. So not even to just one construct. but to one side of one construct. And then another example is something that he said about Jacqueline Suzanne, the woman who wrote, I always forget, The Valley of the Dolls. He says, that's not writing, that's typing, meaning that that's typing and nothing else. This is just, I guess, a snappy way to say trash. So preemptive construing reduces your understanding of someone or something or yourself to just one thing. On the other hand, propositional construing allows us to look at things from several perspectives at once. So it's not an intellectual exercise, it's lived experience. Intellectual exercise can be done by anyone, but that doesn't mean that that person actually uses their constructs in a propositional way. So it's about how you use it in real life. Preemptive construing introduces a lot of clarity into our world. So it's not nice to label someone because prejudice, stereotypes, and all kinds of labeling are preemptive usually. So it's very easy to associate preemptive construing with something bad as well as with perfectionism, but it's not all bad. Remember, Kelly would say that we use constructs in a certain way because it works. Sometimes being preemptive is very important. Like if you're a firefighter going into a burning building, you usually think of yourself as someone who's doing their job and nothing else. Because imagine if a firefighter goes into a burning building and then starts construing, him or herself propositionally. Yes, I'm very brave, but I'm also kind of hungry. I'm also beautiful. But then I'm also a little bit afraid, everyone will die. So sometimes preemptive construing is quite helpful because it introduces a lot of clarity. So perfectionists, when they employ preemptive construing, it's because they need to see clearly and they don't. So you reduce the world to just this one thing that you can differentiate, which is usually good enough, not good enough, perfect, not perfect, right? It helps us feel safe because things suddenly become clear. I think politics is a really good example of how this works, especially in the past couple of years. I mean, politics everywhere in the world has become just so polarized that we kind of tend to label people based on who they vote for. And this is not because necessarily every person who votes for whoever is the same. It's because it allows us to divide the world into the good guys and the bad guys. And then we can go to our side with the good guys, sit there and feel safe, and look at the bad guys and, just distrust them from afar. So, it kind of prevents us from understanding each other, but at the same time, it introduces a lot of clarity, makes things very simple for us. So preemptive construing is problematic in many ways, but it performs a function. So whether it's good or bad depends on where you use it and how you use it. Let's say if you construe yourself, so I'm a therapist. If I'm to construe myself in a preemptive way, I would say all I am is a psychotherapist and nothing else. So that would mean that every time I'm not doing therapy, I would probably feel guilty because I'm abandoning, everything I think I am. So if I'm not necessarily productive doing something, psychological, I would probably feel bad. Fortunately, I see myself in rather propositional terms, so I can also see myself as a person that likes art or that likes to read or hike or, I don't know, play tennis or whatever, sleep. So I'm able to do a lot of things without feeling guilty. Here are some examples of preemptive statements related to perfectionism from my clients. Once I start pulling, I can't stop. I will either pull until nothing is left to pull, or it's as if nothing, just nothing. It's pulling or nothing. So the person is describing that moment when you kind of start entering a pulling trance. So your entire world is then reduced to I must pull or nothing. So either pull or you're nothing. One little thing goes wrong and I feel like a complete and utter failure. This is also preemptive because one thing goes wrong and you feel like nothing else except a failure. You cannot be someone who tried, someone who did their best, someone who wasn't lucky or whatever. No, just a failure. I'm not going to waste my time talking about emotions. They're irrational, they're chemical, period. This is irrational, sorry. this is apparently my unconscious view of what I just read about. So what's preemptive here is that you say emotions are just chemical and nothing else. If we think about sort of using construct in a certain way because it does something, it performs a function, with this specific client, viewing his emotions as being just chemical and nothing else was a very convenient way not to talk about grief and anger and disappointment and sadness, because his life was in ruins, and the only way that he can ignore all of that is to say, well, all these things that I feel is just brain chemistry going crazy. It's not like it has anything to do with the fact that I'm getting a divorce. I'm afraid I will lose my children and I lost my job. Nothing to do with that because it's just chemistry. So in this way, preemption stops him from changing, stops him from getting insight, but it allows him to see things very clearly, inaccurately, but clearly. Then another example. Body-focused repetitive behaviors are really just habits. Let's not pretend like there's anything else there. Help me unlearn them, and that's it. In this case, the client resorts to preemptive constraint because they don't want to talk about the fact that they have no coping skills regarding, intense emotions, for example. So you say it's just a habit, let's just unlearn the habit and be done with it, right? Because that way you kind of reduce the whole topic to what's convenient for you. And because if you were to see this propositionally, you might see that there's a lot of validity in alternative constructions. And that would be very bad because it would open this Pandora's box called your emotional life. So the last term, and then we will go to talk about techniques. So hostility. Kelly has this paper that you can also find online if you like. Many people don't like the way that Kelly writes, but I think he's rather funny, which I think says more about my sense of humor than anything else. So in this paper about hostility, Kelly uses the metaphor of the bed of Procrustes. So he was the son of Poseidon, if I did not forget my Greek mythology. So anyway, Procrustes had this kind of bed and breakfast, and he wanted to be the perfect host. And the fact that he wanted to be the perfect host makes him a very good example for our topic. So a perfect host makes his guests feel absolutely perfectly comfortable. So when you get to his bed and breakfast, he shows you, where your room, you leave your stuff. He makes this amazing dinner. No, not amazing. Perfect dinner. You eat your perfect dinner. You experience perfect culinary pleasure, and then you go to sleep. And then when you go to sleep, he kind of takes a peek in your room because he wants to see, if everything is perfect, because he has to be the perfect host. So sometimes things go well. Like you sleep, he sees that you're sleeping, you're enjoying his perfect bed, everything is just so perfectly comfortable that he just feels perfect. But sometimes people are just too tall, and then their legs stick out. And that really upsets Procrustes because, well, if your legs stick out, then you're not perfectly comfortable. And if you're not perfectly comfortable, then he's not your perfect host. And that is just not possible because he is your perfect host. So in order to solve this dilemma, and he can't go in the middle of the night to get another bed because in this metaphorical ancient Greece, all IKEA stores are closed. So, no IKEA for Procrustes. So what does he do? I mean, how do you solve this issue? Like, how do you restore the view that you have of yourself as being your perfect host? You can't replace the bed. All the other beds in your bed and breakfast are occupied. So the only logical thing that he can do is just get an axe and chop his guest's legs off so that whatever is left of his guest fits perfectly in the bed. So cut your guest's legs off and you remain the perfect host because the bed is now just the right size. And this is hostility, according to Kelly. If you think about it, even hostility in the way that we use this word normally and in psychiatry kind of falls under this umbrella, but Kelly elevates it a little bit. So for Kelly, hostility is something that we employ every time that when we realize that our constructs don't work anymore. So our ideas and theories about the world have just been invalidated. Like when you see a guest that is not perfect, who's not perfectly comfortable, your idea of being perfect is immediately crushed. So you're no longer perfect. But because you cannot think of yourself in any other way except being the perfect host, or at least the Procrustes, you have to force reality to fit into what you want it to be. So you have to cut your guest's legs off so that reality is restored to what you imagine that it has to be, what's perfect. It's essentially when you have bad scientists who will kind of tweak their data until their hypothesis is confirmed. That's hostility. And real scientists, as well as us, personal scientists, because Kelly said that we all behave like scientists in everyday life, by testing out our constructs. This is something that we're often guilty of. So you must preserve your idea of perfection at all costs, even at the cost of reality itself. So this is the third component that's very, very frequently, I would say always present in perfectionism. And here are a few examples here. Pulling is accomplishing something. I know I'm not accomplishing anything, but it feels that way, so I keep doing it. So you have a lot of evidence that suggests that you're really not achieving whatever it is that you want to achieve by pulling. So you know you're not achieving anything, but in the moment when you pull, you tell yourself a different story, or you kind of try to parse your experience in such a way that you find enough evidence, you basically extort evidence to convince yourself that pulling is doing something because you must do it in that moment. So another one. Of course, things can't be perfect, duh, but they can be better, and I should be able to do better. Even though in real life you fail and you just don't do better, you insist at all costs that you must do better. So you have evidence that suggests that this is as much as you can do, but because what you can do is not acceptable to you, you insist that you must be what you fantasize of being or becoming, and you disregard reality and you just keep trying to do better. I resist pulling as long as I can, but there's always this moment when I feel so much tension that I think my body is going to simply explode and I will die, and then I go to the bathroom and pull. It hurts, and I feel like I'm hurting myself, but all the tension goes away. I never explode and die, obviously, but I keep thinking that I will because it feels that way. So even though you have ample experience by virtue of still being alive, that you're not going to die when you feel a lot of tension, you still kind of go around behaving as if you will, and then you pull. Because there's a part of you that's being hostile to reality. And reality is, no matter how tense we are and how anxious we are, anxiety does not kill. So this is another example of hostility. Okay, so hopefully at this point you kind of understand how these three things look like. So what is it that we do? Because Kelly talks about constructs, once we identify one side, we exactly know where we need to move. So movement is implied in Kelly's theory. So from impermeable, we need to go to permeable. From preemptive, we need to go to propositional. So any technique that we employ or any approach that we take in therapy or as self-help to deal with perfectionism goes in that direction. So instead of being hostile to reality, we open ourselves up and allow ourselves to be transformed by that reality. Because at the end of the day, we really have no other choice but to be transformed by reality. Because, that's where we live. So I will give you a few techniques here that will help you in different ways. This is by no means a comprehensive approach to treating perfectionism. This is just something that might help you deal with it easier. These techniques will deal with three different levels. So one would be introducing context, because preemptive construing is really blind to context. Hostility is blind to reality itself, nonetheless to something as simple as context. So impermeability also doesn't think about context. It only thinks about, how many criteria have you satisfied and how many you didn't. So by introducing context into our reasoning intentionally and purposefully, we start to understand our agency, meaning what is it that we can actually do and what are the limits of our agency. So what is it that we cannot do? So when we use context to make decisions, that's when we make decisions that are sustainable, as opposed to perfectionists. The second group of techniques will deal with assessing evidence. As you can see, when you're hostile, you're really not assessing evidence, you're assaulting evidence, because you have to kind of force evidence to be what you need it to be. So we'll talk about establishing facts and asking the right questions at the right time, may I add. And then there's something like a hint of a more comprehensive change, which is to cultivate a different relationship to yourself. So perfectionism, and if it's not clear by now, is absolutely unattainable. The only way to truly cope with perfectionism is just to give up on it. It's not something that it's easy to say, give up. But since perfectionism is usually a trait that's been there for a long time, it's a way of coping with the world that a person uses almost their entire life, not all, often their entire life. So changing that takes a long, long time. So you have to cultivate a relationship towards yourself that will allow you to see yourself differently, not just through the lens of perfectionism. And we do this by cultivating forgiveness and self-compassion. I use these two things because this is something that you can cultivate on your own. When you do this with your therapist, there are much more sophisticated, different techniques that you use, through your relationship. But I wanted to give you something that you can do on your own, so without a therapist as well. So first, let's start with the basics, which is how to set realistic goals, which many talents that perfectionists may have. Setting realistic goals is not one of them. So just remember, every goal has to be SMART. That means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timed. Perfectionist goals are almost never all this. They may be some, but not all. Your goal has to be all of it. It has to be specific. It has to be measurable. Specific means something, so you can't say I have to be the best version of myself. Whenever you define anything in terms like I have to be the best version of myself, I have to achieve all my potentials, I have to be the perfect, boyfriend, son, whatever, that's not a good goal. It doesn't work. The reason why I say this is because when you say I have to be the perfect friend, for example, you're immediately failing because it's not specific. What does it mean to be a perfect friend? If you remember how impermeable thinking works, every time you have this vague definition, like I will be the best version of myself, impermeability will immediately tell you, yeah, but you're never going to be that because this, and then you will find 50 reasons why you'll never be that. And basically, by defining goals that way or values that way, you're essentially just condemning yourself to feel bad. It's just condemning yourself to failure in advance. So it has to be specific. So for example, as a therapist, I work with different kinds of people, every day. Different kinds of people will see me in different ways. In therapy, there's something that we call transference, which is, without going into technicalities, it's the way that your clients see you. And transference is just not a normal objective assessment of a person. It's something very specific that develops in the relationship with your therapist, and it can be quite intense, and it can be everything but objective. So on a daily basis, I hear all kinds of horrible things about myself. Like my clients will be terribly angry at me. They will, project all kinds of things on me. So sometimes it's enough that I say hello and they will say, something like, why do you hate me? Or like, what kind of a hello is that? So I hear all kinds of things. I get all kinds of feedback about me. If I would define my role as a therapist in these terms, like I have to be the most liked therapist, or my clients must always appreciate me. I don't know if I would still be alive, to be perfectly honest, especially because while my practice was mainly offline, I worked with a lot of clients who struggle with either, psychotic disorders or borderline personality disorder, meaning that I really didn't get too many compliments during every day. So I had to define my role as a therapist in very specific terms. So my role is not for my client to say, oh my God, you're the best ever. If my client applies certain constructs in an impermeable way, and for my client, it would be much better for them to use them in a permeable way, then this is how I define my role. I'm going to cause them to construe things in this domain in a more permeable way. So I have a very specific measure of whether or not I'm a good therapist. If my goal is to give you insight and you get insight, I'm fine. You really don't have to like me. Not that I don't want you to like me, like what I mean. Like my point is that I didn't mean to insult anyone. That's what I was saying. Is that you have to define it in a very specific way for it to be attainable, so that you know whether or not you're doing a good job. It has to be measurable, which best version of myself is not measurable. Perfection, not measurable. From impermeable to permeable, quite measurable. So if I don't know, let's say I'm a waiter. I can't define my role by the tips that I get, because whether people will like me or not, will they like my smile or the way that I talk to them? It's not something that I can control. So specific, measurable, attainable. If you set your goals so high, well, you might as well just not even try. I see this very frequently with people who start using TrichStop. Then they will come and they will say, I have been pulling my hair for 25 years and I want to stop as soon as possible. And then 3 weeks in, basically, when you just start doing some practical work, they become very disappointed because they're still pulling. And then I think, wait, you've been doing it for decades and you think it's an attainable goal to stop in 3 weeks? Talk about bad goal setting. I don't think it's impossible to stop. And I most certainly think people can deal with pulling. It's just that 3 weeks may not be attainable for someone. For someone else, it might be. So it's really important to assess your strengths, not what other people achieve, not what you would like to achieve, not what your parents expect you to achieve, but what you can actually achieve right now as you are, with all the faults and hindrances and working hours and whatever else. Goals have to be relevant. This is also something that may seem obvious, but perfectionism often judges us based on really relevant and silly things. So people are sometimes go into a pulling trance that lasts for hours because they've touched one hair that feels different. Can you think of anything more irrelevant? Obviously, in that moment, it doesn't seem that way, but it is ultimately irrelevant because it's not something that other people can see, and it's not something that will in any way alter the course of our lives. So when we set goals consciously, they have to be very relevant. That means right now, for you, they have to be relevant. And they have to be timed. Otherwise, you can declare yourself a failure prematurely. So you also need to know where your boundaries are. One way to introduce context into our thinking is to kind of try to delineate the limits of our agency. Remember my client there when I was talking about impermeability, the so-called bad mother? Remember how she had this long list of things that a good mother does, but that list came down to her from her mother. My client worked and she had a career, and quite a good career. So she worked she had a stressful job and she worked many hours. And yet it never occurred to her that she's not a superwoman. If we go back to the beginning of the webinar to Karen Horney, she said that perfectionists want to mold themselves into supreme beings. Well, you're not. I'm not, no one is. So you have to really realistically assess what is it that you can do. If you're tired, that means you can't do anymore. Here's one place where you can, one moment to learn about your limits, because that's where your limits are. So I mentioned that recently I was giving another lecture about perfectionism, and I was extremely tired that day. I had an unexpectedly difficult and complicated day. And when the time came for me to actually deliver my lecture, I was very tired and I really didn't want to do it. So I did it obviously because people were waiting for me and it was scheduled, but I wasn't really very happy with how I performed. I thought I was slow, I didn't enjoy myself. The feedback was good and people enjoyed it, but I really didn't. And for me, I do this so that I can hopefully give you something useful or insightful. But for me, it's also equally important that I enjoy it. This is why all the examples that I give you that are not written in these slides are examples that come to my mind in the moment. Because I would be bored to death if I had to rehearse this and then just recite it. I wouldn't enjoy it. So for me, it's really important to enjoy it. And that day, I really wasn't enjoying myself. I was tired. I really wasn't in the mood to think about perfectionism. And so my presentation was, in my eyes, everything but perfect. And so I thought, what am I supposed to do? And then I just kind of kept going through it. And then I realized, yeah, but can you really expect more from yourself? Like, you've been awake and working for 12 hours at that point. Why on earth would you expect to perform better? You're doing well enough. People understand what you're saying. They find it interesting, even if you didn't deliver it in the most interesting way you can think of. But if I didn't have this check on how much is realistic to expect of myself, I would be terribly upset because I know I can do better. It's not even a matter of some unrealistically high expectations. I have done better in the past and I know that I can. So if I disregard what the limits of my agency are, I could be very frustrated with myself. But when I put my lecture in the context of my day, which was horrible, and I hope it never repeats again, I have to be realistic and say, well, maybe this is as best as you can do. So this is extremely important. And I'm sure that you're not really happy to hear about this, but this is one of the key things to get rid of perfectionism, is to actually think about your state of mind and the state of your body and your emotional state, and then plan based on that. What we cannot control is not just external. So for example, during that webinar, like Zoom restarted itself, like electricity blinked at one point, which restarted my internet. So there were a lot of external things that I couldn't control. If I would have the expectations that I can control them, I would be really a very frustrated man. Here I am, can't really think the way I want to, can't really talk the way I want to. Now the electricity is not working. I mean, come on. Like, what does the universe have against me? So that's one thing. So things can be external, but we can also find ourselves in a situation that we cannot control internal things. So that day, I really wasn't fully in control of my own intellect. I was obviously functional. I know the material that I'm talking about. So it's not like I'm going to have a stroke and forget about constructivism. I don't think that could possibly happen. But my brain wasn't working as fast as I would like it to work. So I wasn't answering questions in the way I wanted to, and so on. So that's internal. That's my own faculty, and I didn't have full control over it. So when you think about what you cannot control, don't think about rain or plane being late or, I don't know, your colleagues not arriving on time. Think about yourself. And what are some parts of yourself that you cannot control? Because these parts exist and it's fine, it's normal, it's human. It only becomes a problem when you refuse to ignore it because your, supreme being fantasy says you must be in control at all times. And then assessing the limits of what we can do is, of course, the key for attainable, for A in SMART. SMART is a really good acronym because it's easy to remember and it's very, very practical and it works very well. So another thing, because if you go back to, sorry, I don't want to repeat the same sentence again, but to go back to Karen Horney, perfectionists have this fantasy that they have to become these supreme beings. If you're a supreme being, you're probably the only supreme being around you. That means that you may judge yourself by your supreme being standards, but you really can't judge other mortals. As Romans used to say, quod licet Jovi non licet bovi, if I remember correctly. So perfectionists often have double standards. When I say double standards, I don't mean lying or cheating in some way. I literally mean a double set of standards. There is one set that you use to judge other people. So when other people fail at something, you might tell them, oh, don't worry, it's not a big deal, it's just one thing. You're really, a great person overall, just learn your lesson and move on and don't worry. If someone doesn't do what you expect them to do, you may have a system of double standards, and then you can say, well, fine, you're just human. My client, the one that cleans up and washes and does everything because her husband apparently doesn't know how to wash dishes, she's not angry at her husband because she thinks it's fine if he doesn't do it perfectly, but she must. So make an effort to clearly differentiate how you judge other people and how you judge yourself. And if this double standard situation is the case for you, then try to judge yourself as if you were someone else. So this is a very practical experiment. When you do things, like let's say you're about to write a report for work, immediately in advance, set the intention to judge yourself by the criteria that you would use to judge other people. Be other for yourself for that 1 hour or 2 hours. I mean, challenge this very unfair situation where you have to be a supreme being, whereas other people are allowed to be just ordinary, fallible mortals. When you notice that inner tyrant that Karen Horney wrote about, saying that you must adhere to these standards, ask it for reasons. Try to spell out consequences. What's different for you versus other people? Rebel against that tyranny of shoulds. You can do that by making a very conscious effort to eliminate should from the way you talk. This is also a rather interesting experiment because it makes you mindful of your perfectionism. Give yourself 24 hours to not use a single should in your speech. It's like no shoulding allowed. And then replace that with something else. Replace every should with something that Kelly would call more invitational. So don't say, I must be, I must be awake to see, this movie after I work for 12 hours. Say it would be really nice if I could, and then plan with that. And then make a conscious effort to correct your thoughts when you catch yourself having all these shoulds. And then try to replace them with, it would be good, or I can try to, or something along these lines. Something that's not prescriptive, but that expresses a desire or a wish. Another thing that you can do, although this can be a little bit radical, so be careful to tailor the experiment to something that you can actually do. So spend an hour every day doing the opposite of what you should be doing. If you absolutely should be productive all the time, take some time and deliberately do nothing productive. If you have to be productive, then spend 20 minutes like looking at the ceiling, or just read a book or meditate, or just do something that you think is utterly unproductive. And then see what happens and examine what the consequences were. How is this altering your life? How is this affecting your relationship, if at all? Is this changing anything inside of you? What was the experience like of not being productive? When you do this, you have to be very careful and intentional about not being preemptive and not being impermeable, because the temptation will be great to say, I was anxious, it was horrible, and never want to do it again. Be propositional. So try to look at different perspectives of your experience. Propositionality is in general a key to change, because there was one Yugoslav writer who, if I can say that I have a favorite writer, that would be him. Danilo Kish was his name. He said once that there's no danger in reading books. There's only the danger of reading one book. If you think that one story has all the answers, that your version of events is the absolute truth, that's the problem. And that's also the problem of perfectionism, because it believes that it is the truth. So propositionality allows us to see that there is validity in other points of view. And this is really the incipient moment of every change. This is how it starts. When you realize, even if you can't immediately kind of create a new narrative around who you want to be and how you see yourself, by having this flash of propositional constraint, you know that there are other plausible stories out there. That the truth of perfectionism is not the only one. And once you actually experience that, not just intellectually, but kind of in your real life, in your lived experience, that's usually a game changer. That's the moment when you actually start looking for other realistic and sustainable approaches. Narrative therapy and constructivist therapy have a technique where you actually visualize yourself, or just envision yourself. Whether or not you actually visualize is really up to you, as being not one person, but something that we in constructivism call a community of selves. So as if you were like a community of different people. When we talk about having an inner tyrant, that means that there's at least two of you in there. There's someone who has to serve the tyrant, and then there's the tyrant. So focus on that part and try to really kind of see what kind of a person is that. Try to imagine the way your tyrant looks, the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they move, the gestures they make. Really visualize them, because this is very useful. Because when they exist in this abstract way, these shoulds that we have, they're everywhere. When something is very abstract, it's very easy to be afraid of it. I was thinking the other day about sort of different reactions that people are having, not biological, but psychological, to the COVID vaccine. And so as someone, who's a doctor, I'm thrilled with the idea of having the RNA vaccine. I think it's brilliant. And, I can't wait to get it. And then, because to me, it's so clear why it should be safe and why it should work well, because, well, you spend a lot of time learning about genetics in medical school, so it's very clear to me. And then I thought, like, why is it that these people just don't believe that it's good because it's so simple? But then I thought, is it simple though? Because it's simple to me, but how many people can actually explain how proteins are made and where RNA is as opposed to DNA and how the cell looks like? How many people do that unless they're studying biology or something like that? And then I realized that for them, this is like this vague fear, this kind of scary, strange thing, because no one bothered to explain it clearly enough. And this is how our shoulds look to us. When we don't have them visualized as one part of ourselves, one object, one person, they're diffuse and they're everywhere and they're very vague. If you've noticed, conspiracy theories are never very clear. They're never person A did something to person B. There's always a cover-up, something is vague. There's always reading between the lines. This is how our shoulds exist in our minds. So when you give them a definitive shape and form, you can actually interact with them. You can establish a dialogue. Back in the olden days, when we used to be able to stay in the same room with our clients, we did this as a very practical experiential thing. Like, you do this, you visualize and personify your shoulds. Then we put them on a chair and you actually talk to them. You kind of switch chairs and engage in dialogue. So it can be really very productive, because you get to really understand your shoulds, and then you get to see what works, what doesn't work, what needs to be changed, and you develop a different relationships to them. Because it's not the same thing if a should is a universal truth and if a should is just someone else's opinion. When it's someone else's opinion, you can just say thanks for sharing and move on. So that's also a way to disempower them. So the two last techniques, and then we're going to the Q&A. So forgiveness, but I wouldn't call this a technique in the moment when you feel anxious or when perfectionism kicks in. This is more of a long-term approach to deal with perfectionism. So when I talk about forgiveness, I'm not talking about something, strange with auras and lavender clouds. So it's actually just acceptance of our flaws and learning how to let go and move on. Letting go means not clinging to them, not when you do something bad, when you make a mistake, that hurts, right? It's not pleasant. If we hurt someone we love, it hurts. When this happens, what we usually do, especially if you're a perfectionist who's not allowed to make mistakes, instead of letting this pain go, we basically hug the pain to punish ourselves. So this only increases our suffering. And, I guess you don't need to be a genius to see that it's better to suffer less than more. So by letting go, we actually save ourselves from unnecessary suffering. Then we can learn from what happened and then move on. So acceptance, letting go, we can insert learning and moving on. That would be forgiveness. Forgiveness can be cultivated in formal and informal practice. Formal practice is when you sit down every day and meditate and cultivate forgiveness. There are forgiveness meditations, which are usually visualizations where you visualize certain people and yourself, and then you recall some situations, and then you learn how to forgive and let go. Forgive others and forgive yourselves. And then there are other types of meditation where you use certain phrases that you reflect on and repeat, but that would be formal meditation. Informal practice would be to actually try and forgive yourself for every small little imperfection and every small failure that happens during the day. Forgiveness, in constructivist technical terms, is a way to produce permeability. What it does, remember that one side of the construct that only accepts one thing when you fulfill the whole list? Forgiveness actually kind of stretches that, and it says, okay, fine. You can do 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. You can still be good. So that's what forgiveness does. It kind of increases permeability and decreases impermeability. It also helps us deal with anger and frustrations that naturally arise from failing. One way to cultivate it informally is that when you catch yourself being angry or frustrated, you can simply ask yourself in the moment, would you rather be angry or free now? Don't ask it for, just for the sake of asking. Really feel the question and feel your answer. By doing these small little steps, eventually you will learn to how to extend forgiveness more naturally to yourself. Ideally, you combine formal and informal practice. Self-compassion is essentially our desire to reduce suffering. Like I said, when something painful happens, we can either cling to our suffering or let go. Letting go doesn't mean dissociating from the suffering. It just means experiencing it while it's there and then letting it leave when it wants to leave. If we cling to the suffering, to be honest, also if we cling to happiness and if we cling to validation, that also causes suffering because all our experiences change. They come and go. They're impermanent. If you try to cling to something that's impermanent, that's bound to cause suffering because happiness goes away. And if you try to cling to that happiness, you'll just be frustrated. And if you cling to pain, you're just causing more pain. So when we're compassionate to ourselves, we want to reduce suffering, which means learning to let go, but also learning to extend kindness to ourselves, to reduce suffering. Because if you don't cling to something, you're not increasing suffering, but you're not reducing it either. But then self-compassion is one step further, where you actually take steps to reduce your own suffering. Self-compassion is about as direct antidote to perfectionism as you can get. So if it were a pill, it would be called anti-perfectionism. You can also cultivate that in formal and informal ways. There is a book called The Self-Compassion Workbook by Christine Neff, and it's quite good and quite interesting if you want to work on self-compassion and you need a structured approach. Both forgiveness and self-compassion are good tools to start a more fundamental change. They provide insight and they allow you to sort of slowly create new narratives about who you are. So in the long run, they will allow you to abandon perfectionism. I have to give you a little story about self-compassion. When I've been practicing mindfulness for a long time now, well over a decade, and one of my teachers, and that was a while ago, told me something like, "Well, you're doing very well. Like your focus is very strong. You've developed this and that and blah blah." And he said, "Well, now you need to develop loving kindness and self-compassion. And I thought, oh my God, can you please shoot me? You know, I went to medical school. They don't teach us to be compassionate there. And then he said, yes, that's exactly what you should be doing. And I said, no, please, I will meditate 12 hours a day. Just don't make me, you know, tell myself I'm amazing and I love myself. And my teacher smiled and said, no, just because you resisted, you really should do it. And then I agreed reluctantly because I had great respect for my teacher. But I resisted it, my God, so much. I cannot even tell you. One day, if we talk about self-compassion more, I will maybe give you more about that. But anyway, I started doing it, and after a while, I noticed some changes, and I noticed that I became a little softer towards myself, more forgiving. I'm a very disciplined person, and it's only when I started, like, when we're talking about habit formation, someone asked me how I established mindfulness as my habit, and my answer was, well, one day I decided I will meditate every day, and then I just did it, because I'm very disciplined that way. But it's only when, and I'm really very grateful for it, but it's only when I started practicing self-compassion and loving kindness that I realized that there is a thin line between being disciplined and being, you know, masochistic. And that sometimes I would cross that line. And self-compassion really taught me how to direct my discipline in useful ways and in productive ways, in ways that actually make me grow instead of just suffer. So in that sense, it was a huge revelation personally for me. But there's another thing I want to say. So oftentimes I would sit and repeat these phrases to cultivate self-compassion. Like one of them that I use very frequently in meditation is something like, may you be free from suffering. It's a very simple phrase, but it does the job for me. And I remember when I was taking USMLE's medical boards for step 2, the clinical skills one, the practical one. So I was standing, it's a very stressful situation, not because of perfectionism, but because they're so strict in there that I always think, like, if I blink the wrong way, they will disqualify me and kick me out, and tell me I did something unforgivable. So I was very tense, standing there in front of this door, and inside the door there's an actor pretending to be a patient, and so you're waiting for a signal that you can approach the door and start your examination. So I'm standing there, you know, my hands are shaking, I'm very nervous, and I wanted to check if other people are nervous, but you can't look left or right because that's against the rules. So you have to just look at your door. And I remember thinking, my God, if I could only do self-compassion meditation, that would certainly calm me down. And I thought, well, you can't meditate, obviously, because any second now you will get your sign to go in and start the exam. And then I thought, what if I take a deep breath and just say my self-compassion phrase, which is, may you be free from suffering. And so I did that. I inhaled, exhaled, and just kind of told myself, you know what, Vladimir, may you be free from suffering. And in that instance, it's like all my anxiety and tension just went away. I was completely blown away that this was even possible. But mind you, this was after a couple of years of practicing self-compassion. But that you can actually calm yourself down in such a simple way with such a simple phrase, that I think that was the moment when I truly realized how powerful forgiveness, self-compassion, loving kindness, and these skills are, because it helped me pass the boards. So it really works, and it works in the long run, and it changes you in these ways you can't even really anticipate. I truly had no idea that I had that ability until I did it. And I've done it many times since, and it tends to always work for me. And now, even though I don't spend 45 minutes in the morning cultivating self-compassion, sometimes I do, but most often I don't. That's not my standard practice. I start and finish every meditation practice by offering several phrases to myself and to other people. So it's either self-compassion or loving kindness, so I can keep it as my secret weapon and my resource. So this was the main part. So we're going to go to the Q&A now. If you have anything else to ask, please do. I will start the questions now. Let me end the poll so that we can see, for those of you that have to go, what will be the topic next month.